Hi everyone. In this video, I wanted to talk to you about two things, both of which are tied to the writing exam for the poetry unit. So what I want to start with first actually is to talk about what you're going to be doing in the exam, just so that you know a little bit more about it before you receive your exam tomorrow. So the exam is going to be comprised of three parts. The first part is going to be a short answer section where you're going to see a variety of short answer questions that are going to ask you to do one of three things, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. The next thing that you'll see in the exam is a poem that I've selected for you to read and to answer some questions about. And then the third and biggest part of the writing exam for the poetry unit is going to be a short essay. I often joke and refer to it as a chassé. And this short essay or chassé is going to focus on a close reading of yet another poem that will be supplied in the exam. And I will have some guided instructions to tell you what you need to do to break down the poem from start to finish. And the second part, by the way, of this video that I'm recording right now is going to talk a little bit more about some things that you should keep in mind when you're doing a close reading. So let's start though with the very first part of the exam, which is the short answer portion. That was the first thing I wanted to talk about in this video. So as you can see right now, I'm on the page about sonnets about war and oppression. And as you can see in the screen, I've focused on the bullet points, the various questions or prompts that then were used for a discussion board post. Now, these give you a fairly good idea of what my short answer questions might look like. They can also take on different forms, and again, I'll talk about that in just a second, but you've actually encountered short answer questions that are relatively typical to my exams with this group of prompts and questions. And what you should note about these particular prompts or questions is that they do a couple of the things that you should expect to see in the short answers you'll see in the exam for the poetry unit. So let me just pause or move over to the side for a second and explain to you the three types of short answer questions that you're going to see in the exam. And then we'll come back and talk very briefly about these questions here and how they kind of reflect what I was just talking about. So there are three types of short answer questions that you can expect to see in the exam. The first type is the comparative type. This is going to be the one that's probably the most active for our exam. The comparative type is simply where I ask you to compare and contrast a theme that two or more poems share in common and look for important ways that those poems treat that theme, either in similar or different ways, or what arguments about the theme those poems share in common, or the ways in which they differ in what they say about that shared theme. That's a really, really typical question or type of question that I use in my exams. Another typical type is where I ask about a specific theme in a specific poem, and I ask you to talk about the various arguments that the poem is making about that particular theme. So that's another relatively common question in my writing exams. And the third type that you can expect to see in the exam is a question in which I talk about a specific literary device or technique, and I ask you to trace its use in the poem or how the particular literary device or technique is represented or displayed in the poem, or how it relates to the overall meaning of the poem. So that's also a fairly typical type that I will use in many of my writing exams. There is a possibility, by the way, that another type I might use is the one where I take a short line or passage from a poem and ask you to closely analyze it. It's sort of like doing a close reading, but in this case, you're looking at a very specific line to talk about it in relation to things like tone or theme. So with all of that said, you've got the basic idea of the types of questions, and I am going to be posting a file that gives you further suggestions about how to approach these types of questions that I use in my exam, so please be on the lookout for that. But let's go ahead and take a quick look at these questions that you see here. And if you look at each of these bullet points in turn, you'll see some of what I've just described. The first bullet point is about the use of alliteration in Anthem for Doomed Youth and the Soldier, whereas the very second bullet point is really talking about a specific theme, patriotism, in the Soldier. The third bullet point is about literary device, the tone in Anthem for Doomed Youth. Likewise, the fourth bullet point is also a question that involves a specific literary term, even more particularly a specific kind of poem. And then as we continue on, you'll see that the fifth bullet point is a question that involves some more literary devices, tone and theme in relation to McKay's poem, pardon me, If We Must Die. Then, as you see in the last two bullet points, the central message of McKay's poem, that's a focus on theme in particular. Then the last bullet point that asks a question, in what ways is McKay's poem still relevant today? That one's a bit different because we're not going to really do a question like that. But still, it asks you to think about specific themes and ideas, just bringing them up to present day. So again, you've already seen some good examples of the types of short answer questions that I work with. I'm going to go ahead and move over now to talking about some tips and strategies for addressing your close reading. So we're going to do that next. Okay, so now we're over in the discussion boards. Specifically, we're in the discussion board close reading practice number 1. I emailed you earlier this week to let you know that I had made a post here in this discussion board based on the things that I was seeing in the very first close reading practice discussion posts. And based on what I saw, I put together basically two things. One was a sample close reading of the 4 lines from William Matthews' A Happy Childhood, the same 4 lines that I asked you to work with for that very first discussion post close reading. And the other part, the one that we're looking at right now, is the kind of pointers of how to approach a close reading fairly successfully and in the ways that I'm looking for and that generally are asked for when you are being assigned to do a close reading or a passage explication. So number 1 specifically has to do with your only working with a short passage like we did for this particular discussion board. This is really important that when you're working on a close reading, regardless of how long the passage is that you're working with, whether it's only a short selection like we did with the selection from A Happy Childhood, or whether it's an entire poem, that you focus only on what's in front of you. When we're dealing with a short passage, an excerpt from a longer text, you want to especially only focus on the passage in front of you and not refer back to other parts of the poem or events in the poem or the text if we're dealing with a passage from a short story, because what I'm asking you to do is to really take a close look at the thing in front of you and not to try to talk about the entire text. So this is one thing that in particular with this first round of posts, a lot of people were doing, which was very understandable. But when you're doing a true close reading, you only deal with what's right on the page and with nothing else. And that's why number 2 is also important. You don't engage in personal response. While your personal response and how you felt about the poem, what it made you think about, how you related to the poem, that's all very, very relevant and very important. But close readings are about the mechanics of a text. And especially when we're talking about a poem, it's about how a poem has been put together. So important elements like word choice, repetition, and so forth, I want to see you identifying those as you break down a passage, or in the case of our exam, an entire poem, and to focus on thematic concerns and the deeper meaning of the poem, and not necessarily connect it back to yourself. Because again, this is not a personal response. This is a close reading of a poem, that the larger idea is to show me that you know what literary devices are at work, what's important about how the poem has been arranged or put together, and of course to identify important themes or ideas. So one of the things that I'm going to really suggest that you consider doing with the close reading that you'll do in the exam is to start by explaining your thesis, presenting a thesis, one specifically that identifies what this passage or the poem's central idea is and the significant devices that the poem as a whole uses, simile, metaphor, repetition, etc. Now, as you make your way through the poem that you're analyzing, you should use phrases or words from the poem to supply evidence. Make sure that when you supply this evidence, that you don't just drop in the quote and leave it as is. Use it to show a particular idea, to illustrate a particular point. And one thing that I think might be really useful to do as you're getting started is what I say in number 5. Pay attention to each line and ask yourself, what is the most important word in this line and why? This starts to give you a sense of what the poet is doing with language, with word choice. And so this might be a useful way to get started just in terms of organizing some notes, thoughts, and ideas. So I do recommend number 5. In general, with the last two things, all I'm going to say is this. Some of your poems may have a rhyme scheme. If you know that it does, make sure to note it because I'll be looking for you to note it. If it doesn't, you can simply say that the poem does not use a rhyme scheme of any sort and you just move on. But if it does have a rhyme scheme, you want to think about if that rhyme scheme is at all important to the sound of the poem, even to kind of a rhythm or even to the tone perhaps that the poem is trying to establish. Lastly, think about how the passage, if we're dealing with just a passage, reflects the larger message or theme of the poem. And in general, this might be something to think about as you look at stanzas, as you move from one stanza to the next. Think about whether a stanza has a particular function in the poem. What is it saying? So what is its content? What action does it describe? And how does it connect to the larger themes or ideas of the poem? So whether you're dealing with a passage where I would ask you to talk about the larger message or theme, if you're dealing with an entire poem, think about the poem in its parts and ask yourself, what job is each part of this poem doing? How does that job connect to the larger story of the poem? And how does that particular part reflect important ideas of the poem itself? So these are the things I'm going to recommend that you keep in mind as you're working your way through the exam. If you have additional questions, please let me know. Once you get started with the exam, I will still be available for some clarification, but I will not be able to really answer your questions in much detail, particularly if they're questions that are trying to move towards answering how to answer a question or how to deal with part of the exam. So we'll have to be careful how we approach your questions, but I still encourage you to ask me questions if you need some clarification about what you're being asked to do in the exam itself. And I also encourage you to email me or reach out so that you can ask me questions about any of the poems that you don't still feel very solid about, that you would like a little help with before you proceed into the exam. So with all of that said, I hope you guys have a good weekend and good luck with the exam this weekend too.